with the University of Sydney and the Green Building Council of Australia and with the Israeli Embassy in Canberra. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Ori Danieli. I am the CEO of Technion Australia, which is the representative arm of the Technion in Australia. Technion, for those of you who are less familiar, is Israel's Institute of Technology. And I wanted to share this morning, I was listening to a podcast, like many of us do these days, to the fabulous Dr. Ron Finkel, who was the recent Chief Scientist of Australia, and he was running a Q&A about climate change. One of the questions that came from the audience was, is it really Australia and small countries, I guess, like Israel, responsibility to tackle climate initiatives? Shouldn't it be something that the major, America and India and China and Russia should really be addressing? And he gave a really interesting analogy, I thought. He said, look at all the countries in the world as one soccer team. And yes, every soccer team has its Ronaldo or Messi, and not everyone is the main player there, but it doesn't mean that the other players can just sit back and let everything happen. And it's really a joint responsibility of everyone, small, large, big economies, small economies, to play a significant role in tackling climate change. And we know that buildings, construction contribute significantly to the impact on our climate. And that is the reason why today we invited our experts, our panel, to share some insight, what can be done in that respect to help reduce our environmental impact. We've got with us the fabulous Davina Rooney, who is the CEO of the Green Building Council Australia, and it's a place that has particular close to my heart because I used to work for the Green Building Council many years ago. The Green Building Council developed a rating system. It's called the Green Star rating scheme that basically encourages sustainable development in our community, and I'm sure Davina will expand more about it. We've got Jonathan Groswasser. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. He's our guest from Israel. He is a partner at one of Israel's most prestigious architecture firms, Yashar Architects, and he's also a graduate of our university, of the Technion. And the discussion today will be moderated by Dr. Martin Tomczyk, who is a professor at Sydney University from the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. So he will be moderating the conversation. Before we dive in, I want to invite my good friend and favorite Deputy Ambassador, Mr. Ron Gerstenfeld, to formally welcome the guests, our partners from the Israeli Embassy. Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Ori, and welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to collaborate once again with you, Ori, and Technion, but also with our distinguished friends from Israel, Yashar Architect, Jonathan Groswasser, with Davina Rooney from the Green Building Council, and with you, Martin, from University of Sydney, and all our friends here that are watching us. Just want to mention, I'm sure that Jonathan will be speaking about it, that Toha Tower, designed by Jonathan and his partner at Yashar Architect, was recently named by the title of Best Office Building in the World by the Council on Tall Building and Urban Habitat in Chicago, which is very, very prestigious and make us very, very proud to have, because when you're talking about Israel and you're talking about startup nation and scale-up nation, you usually talk the traditional high-tech cyber issue, but there's a lot of excellence and very prestigious work that's been done in the field of design. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jonathan, that your firm is in charge of some of important part of the landscape and coastline and skyline of the favorite city of mine in Israel, Tel Aviv. So I wish you a very good and successful event. And thank you very much for the collaboration again. Back to you, Ori.
Thank you, Ron. Just before I hand over to Davina, just a reminder, as with all our webinars, this is an opportunity for you to interact and engage with our speakers. So I'm sure by now everyone knows how to use Zoom, but there's a Q&A button at the bottom, so you can post your questions at any point, and our speakers will do their best to answer On that note, Davina just had her last sip of tea, and she should be ready now. So we're going to start with Davina. She'll hand over to Jonathan, and then Martin will moderate the conversation. Enjoy. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. How wonderful to have everyone here. It's a real privilege to join you. And so what I'll do is I'll share my screen, and so we can have a great conversation. So the focus of today is I'm from the Green Building Council of Australia. I'm giving a little bit of context and overview about sustainable buildings. We have, a really broad audience, some who are deeply engaged on sustainability, some people who, it's their hobby. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the issues, why buildings are important. And then I have the privilege to hand over to Jonathan, who's going to give a really detailed case study. And then we're sort of going to unpack how do we take these concepts, how do we take these detailed examples, and how do we bring them together and answer some of your questions about the important world of sustainable buildings. And so just to give, just in starting to give a little bit of an overview of who's the Green Building Council of Australia and what do we do, we're part of a global network of Green Building Councils. So there's over 70 Green Building Councils who form part of the World Green Building Council. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we do, we rate buildings. So the kind of example that Jonathan's talking about, there's a number of international rating systems, whether it's ourselves or our partners in America have, also use the global rating tool LEED. So we help verify the outcomes of sustainable buildings. So if someone comes and presents at a forum like this and they say, I've done a really sustainable building, you know that someone's been through and they've checked the details of what's the energy usage, what's the water, gone through all of that important information. We advocate, we seek to partner with government and look at what's the critical alignment of issues, how do we change things so that when we decide that we're actually going to embed things, we update our building codes or we update our policies in this space. An example is we put a trajectory for net zero buildings with our federal minister and are looking to implement quite an amount of that in the building code at the moment. We educate, so we run conferences, events, or partner with things like today. And most importantly, what do? We collaborate. So whether it's, working with our partners internationally, we're very privileged. One of the members of my board, Tanya Cox, is the chair of the World Green Building Council. And so we all work together in this really important space to drive change within sustainability. So, when we talk about rating buildings, there's an enormous overview of what this means from, some of the tallest buildings in the world, hotels, retail, the broadest context of opportunities. And so lots of buildings of every type. And as I mentioned, when we talk about who we partner with and how collaboration works in this space, it's everything from the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark to the International World Building Institute. I sit on their Global Governance Council, or the World Green Building Council, or a spectrum of organisations in between. And basically, these things are so important that we all have to head in the right direction. We all have to be on Ori's soccer team. Or, when some people ask me, I was asked once by a tax department, why does Australia, in this case, have to participate? And I said, okay, if you only go after the big ones, why do you require everyone to pay tax? And then they said, no, everyone has to pay tax. And I said, well, that's the same concept, whether you're on Ori's soccer team or contributing to a global effort, absolutely everyone needs to look and pull their weight in this space. And so a question that people sometimes ask me is why, when we talk about sustainability, do people often want to talk about the built environment? And the reason for that is that we're a big part of the problem, but if done right, we can be a big part of the solution. So, when we look at climate action, buildings are responsible for about 39% of global carbon emissions. On the resources side, buildings use about 50% of global materials. These are World Green Building Council statistics. And health and well-being, over 90% of people globally are in a location where the air pollution levels are above those recommended by, the World Health Organization. And what we know is people spend more than 90% of their time indoors. So when we improve the built environment, we improve these areas. And also by 2050, it's noted that on the current rate of growth of buildings, we're going to double the amount of global footprint we have. So, you know, the enormous building projects, like the one that Jonathan will talk about, that's a trend we're going to see in the future. So if we're going to absolutely get to net zero, which all the critical reports tell us we need to do, it's really fundamental for our planet, we really need to go after the built environment sector first. We're a big opportunity, but as we'll see in the case study, there's a large number of things that we can do in this space, and they're pretty simple and practical, and we can actually work through them in the built form. And so when we say, right, 39% of carbon emissions, we absolutely have a focus on climate action. When we say there's a huge amount of materials that go into this space, that all relates to circular economy. And then absolutely, as we've seen in the last 18 months, health and well-being are fundamental. You know, I think a big discovery moment for Australia was in the horror bushfires of 2019, 2020. We realised just how important our air quality was. Or in the pandemic over the last 18 months, there's been absolute clarity in that area. And so one of the things I draw out is when there's a headline like climate action, what does that mean? That means net zero buildings, highly efficient buildings powered by renewables. It means that we need to design our buildings for the future. We need to look at nature-based solutions. So when we actually look at the detailed areas that we seek to unpack from buildings, they come from these global trends. Now, sometimes people say to me, how do we possibly focus on the environment while everything else is happening in the world right now? It's been a pretty COVID-dominated world in the last 18 months when we look at things, but I must say, I think back to this cartoon from The Economist that kind of shows the Earth in round, you know, planet Earth in round one with the coronavirus in the preliminary round, but then the heavy weight of climate change is waiting for the later part of the discussion. So what's really clear and what we've seen from governments around the world is there's a real opportunity for renewal in green investment in these kind of contexts. This is kind of the last chance saloon, as Charles said to the Australian Prime Minister this morning. If you're looking at COP, we really need to be focusing on that as our last chance saloon. And so at the moment, within the last 6 weeks, a really important report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a report, which is the first of 3 reports. And it looked at what does it mean for the world in the future. And the thing that that report told us is that globally, we're already at 1.1 degrees over pre-industrial levels. Within Australia itself, we're at 1.4 degrees. And what we know is we're going to see bigger heat waves, bigger floods, colder weather snaps, and frequency of extreme events. And so if we keep going at current rates, we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees, which is considered by most scientists as a critical tipping point in 10 to 12 years. So this is, you know, the red alert report that we absolutely need to see and see how we can change. And for us, it absolutely recommends strong, rapid and sustained reductions, emissions net zero 2050 at the latest, and that we need to be focused on nature-based solutions. So many of us would say, how does this possibly relate to buildings? Well, it means that we need to be having responsible, healthy, resilient and positive places that are designed around people and nature. And in really practical terms, some of the things that you'll see Jonathan unpack is in his discussion is, you know, we need to have buildings with an enormous focus on light quality and daylight. We need to have them focused on net zero, you know, driving efficiency to the absolute limit so we can have the most efficient buildings, so we can have them ready for net zero or delivering net zero now. That needs to be an enormous focus on this space, whilst we look at, you know, biodiversity impacts and look at a whole suite of issues. But one of the things that it's really heartening to see in these spaces is when we line up what we want to achieve and translate them, take the global trends, translate them into rating tools, projects like the one we're about to discuss, absolutely take these initiatives and embed them in their projects, and we can see those really clearly implemented. So Burwood Brickworks, which is the project behind me's 6-star Green Star rated. It has more renewables, so it's net zero in operation. It actually produces more energy than is used on site. We're talking about this just as we're jumping on the webinar. It's also water positive. It also has a rooftop gardens that are used in some of the restaurants inside, and aspects of which are open to the community. So really project examples, bringing these concepts to life. And what I'm really enthusiastic about is we're going to use this discussion to unpack how do we take these ideas, how do we take a case study, and then how do we implement them, and hear great questions from the audience. How do we actually implement more of those at scale? And what's really important is when we look at buildings, we absolutely need to be looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So picking out all the critical elements that are necessary for the future of the planet, be those aspects directly around energy, water, waste, or how we partner to drive change. There's an enormous amount of areas that we need to be working together to drive in these aspects. And so what we did when we designed the next version of the tool was we took out the key focus areas: health and wellbeing, climate action, resource efficiency. This isn't actually a beautiful PR diagram. This is actually a pie chart of how we allocated the points. So, 39% of the tool is on climate action, a third is on resource efficiency, the balance is on health and wellbeing. So we absolutely align what we're going to deliver out of the built environment to the needs on projects. And so people often say, so when you're talking about these buildings, what are the minimum things that you would absolutely be looking at? And so the things you'd be really focused on is protecting environmentally significant areas, making sure that they emit less carbon, both in the way they're built. People call that upfront carbon emissions, or embodied carbon sometimes. Water efficient, taps and toilets that are absolutely as efficient as they can be possible, and that it has improved air, light, and acoustics, promotes physical well-being in people, and then really importantly that it's designed for the future. It's built to withstand the impacts of climate change. It absolutely looks to manage environmental impacts during construction, focus on diversity and operational waste, and then really critically, it's verified that someone checked, and this is absolutely the same with the LEED rating system that Jonathan's going to be using as the framework for the building. It's someone's checked that you did what you said you'd do. It was verified that it would perform in that way. And so when people say to me, what are the rewards, apart from having better light quality for my customers, what's in it for me? Why would I seek to implement these frameworks? And it was when we're talking with Martin, he was sort of saying one of the challenges that we'd like to unpack in the discussion is that people are always asking us, what does it look like in this space? Why would I pay more for this? And so one of the trends that I'd like to note is green finance as a trend. We're finding that sustainable buildings, there's far greater investor demand for them. And people say, but it'll cost more. And, it'll cost 10% more, it'll cost 15% more, it'll cost 20% more. We've done quite a lot of research in this area and found that it costs 1 to 3% more. So around 1% for a best practice building, 2.5% to sort of 3% while you're up to the country level excellence or global excellence metric. But we've done research in those asset classes and found that as soon as those buildings are delivered, verified to higher sustainability standards, they're a 5% premium in value when they're sold. Their net income is 13% more, and people want to stay longer. So in the office buildings, that is their weighted average lease expiry, which is a technical term for how long people are going to stay. They stay on average 25% longer, and that's before you even look at critical research from our partners in the United States about looking at the kind of productivity gains that people get from being in these spaces. They feel better, they do better work, and which can directly correlate into profitability numbers, annual profit that is contributed by those employees to their company. And so when we look at how that rolls up to global frameworks, we absolutely need to get to net zero by 2050, but the built environment really needs to drive and lead that a lot earlier. So a program that we run is getting leading partners to deliver net zero by 2030 within their operating buildings and have net zero in carbon. It's just been announced by the World Green Building Council that from 2030, that'll be a requirement for buildings to be net zero for all new buildings for their carbon emissions within this commitment. And so it's been a real privilege for us to partner to have over 2,500 buildings in this program within Australia. This is something we're really looking to expand. And this shows that it's not just about new buildings when you take on these challenges, it can be absolutely expanded to being across existing buildings as well. And one of our partners who's been working in this space for a really long time, GPT with their wholesale asset fund, last year they certified carbon neutral across their existing portfolio range. They managed to do that 45% with building efficiency, about the same amount through renewables, and they bought nature-based offsets for the remainder. But what this shows is that this can be done absolutely right now. And the bit that I'd like to unpack in the discussion panel where we get to that stage is that this was done actually delivering $10 million savings a year. And across this portfolio, their efficiencies have been, they're over $250 million across GPT in savings that they've actually been able to deliver out of these programs since inception. So what we're seeing is when these things are done right as part of a staged program at scale, we see enormous opportunities for these to be delivered. So I'm going to pause there in terms of setting the scene in what sustainable buildings look like. And I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, who's going to give us an example of how this looks in his key project, and then we're going to unpack it together in discussion. So thank you so much, Jonathan, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Davina. Let me share my screen. So I'm very excited to present the Toha building. It's a work we've completed last year with Ron Arad Architects from London, and it's a very unique design. The developers were Amot and Gaviam, two very dominant real estate companies from Israel, and it won Best Building by the Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. It also won the Best Green Building Award and also an award for the interior design in the same competition. And the uniqueness of this building definitely is derived by its approach to sustainability and innovation. And from whatever angle you look at it, it looks different, and it looks that it's done something different to the surrounding of this building. The key idea about this building is first that it doesn't take out a lot of the footprint from the landscape. It's basically raised by 6 floors of technical facilities from the landscape. And these technical facilities allow for a very good and broad space in the landscape. And it also frees up the rooftop. So that frees up another usable space that we've taken from the land. And obviously when you construct a new building, the significant thing that you do is you take up land that could have been used for landscaping or agriculture, and you need to give back some of this land back. The design was is actually an initial design of and the 57,000 square meter development is actually the smaller part of the development. We are now designing the 80-floor addition to this complex. And these are drawings by Ron Arad, who's an incredibly innovative designer that has set a lot of these ideas in the beginning of the process. Another important issue is actually building in a central location. When you build in a central location, these are the first ideas. The first goal is actually you minimize the use of cars. People arrive with public transport, and this is something that doesn't have anything to do with whatever type of building it is. Just every car that we take out of the road and people can use public transport obviously has a much more and significant impact on the environment. So looking at the site, we actually can see that this is the first development, that it's a minimum footprint of the building. And there are two cores that reach the ground, and on top of it, the building begins its floors. The building has a very unique atrium in the center. This atrium is used to cool the mass of the building, and so air is entered through the lower floors and then reaches up to the top floor, where it's being taken out one floor below the rooftop. The structure is very unique as well. There is no one straight column. Obviously, because of the raising of those 3,000 square meters of office floors from the ground by those three cores, we needed a very different type of structure. And the columns that we used actually changed their vectors somewhere along the way. And in this process, we had to design. We used the arrow for our structural design, and this was very helpful in finding out where these columns would meet somewhere halfway through the building. And here you see how the landscape is being freed up by actually laying those floors on top of those technical cores. There's also another issue. When we deal with those cores halfway through the buildings, we were able to use then water-cooled chillers, which then are saving up space and allowing us to free up the roof. The water from those water-cooled chillers are used to watering the landscape. So we actually scored the top score on the reuse of water on this site. So all the systems are located on those the first 6 floors, and then we're also taking out air from those lower legs and then pumping them up to the building. I think with this project, sustainable design was a key concept from the beginning. And when you do this, every time you're tackled with an issue, you have to solve an issue. If there's dealing with sunlight or glazing or floor layout, you always go back to those initial concepts, and you reflect on how this works together with sustainability and with the well-being of the people in the building, and how do you save energy through this work. So a lot of issues definitely relate to sunlight, with the angles of the building actually allowed to shade parts of it and react to the orbit of the sun, to the, and which facades take up most of the sun. Obviously those southern and the western facades, which take up a lot of the heat during work hours. But also we were able to cool the buildings in the early hours of the morning by pumping the air through the atrium and cooling the mass of the building. So this has gotten it's the first building to receive a platinum certification from we use LEED. It's the American system. And LEED is part of the idea of using LEED is that a lot of those companies that occupy the buildings have offices in the US and have knowledge of the US standards. And we've even got to a point where we've looked at how water are dripping on the building, and are we able to allow water to then reach the ground in a slower pace, and then being able to go down into the earth, and not just having floods on the lower levels, and in this way have all the water go through the drainage system and directly to the sea. So sunlight was a big issue, and the facades was another issue that we used. A double skin facade here. We used the cool chillers and the water cooling system for those chillers. We use a dual flush WC. All the toilets. We're cleaning the water and then reusing it for the landscape. And we have this atrium night cooling that we allow air to go through the building and cool it through the early hours of the morning. We're monitoring, this is a small, but another issue, key issue, we're monitoring all the delivery of through the buildings and into the building to minimize waste. Using double skin facades, we're also allowing, double skin facades means that we have a layer of air in between the first layer of glass and the double skin and the double glazed glass in the interior part. And this allows air to insulate the building, where the cavity between those glasses is being sucked to the rooftop. And this air is then cooled in between and insulates the building. It allows for a better use of the area next to the walls of the building, so it has an economical impact on companies that rent the buildings and know that they can use every square meter inside the building. So this is this system, and we were able to show tenants how they can make a better use of their environment inside the floor space. We've looked at how wind is then and is going around the building, and what sort of wind mass we have on the lower floors and on the upper floors, and tweak the design of the building accordingly. And eventually we received this the TOA building, and you see here the rooftop is used for over 350 people restaurant. And then we grew the vegetation throughout the construction of the building. So when the building is now finished, we have a vegetation that is fully grown. This is the first part of the TOA, and this is, you can see here those legs that raise the buildings and have the floors then on top of these legs starting from the 7th floor, and how we freed up the roof. A key importance is those shelves that we call these horizontal terraces that we have. And this allows shading for each floor. Usually when you have a curtain wall system, and there's no shading, or you're adding some complex system that is not very pleasing and doesn't do the work. And here what we've done is we've created these shading shelves, and these shade every floor, and this is very important. You need a small shading shelf, and I think you're saving more than 30% of the energy, more than 70% of the cooling system you need inside the floor. So here you see the atrium. This is the atrium to the building, and we have windows here that open up to allow for air to come in through the lower floors and then going up to the roof. The landscaping was very important. We had an excellent landscape designer, an Israeli firm called Tema, and And we're using biological pool. We're obviously recycling water from the building in order to water the planting, and just having those biological self-sustained pools around the building, and also watering the plant inside the lobbies and on the rooftop. So this is the lobby that also won the award for Best Interior by the CBUH Council. So this is the first phase of the building, and we're now adding the second phase that is 150,000 square meter development adjacent to it. You can see that the rooftop will be joining a sky lobby on the 30th floor, and we'll have another sky lobby on the 60th floor. This development will still maintain those, we're actually using about a third of the site for construction, and 2/3 is then being left for landscaping. And we'll have 2 metro stations at the entrance to those towers. So hopefully they will be completed when the tower is complete in about 2025, because we've already started the construction for the second tower now. In terms of rents, there's the highest rent ever paid for development for this tower. So those companies and the public definitely acknowledges the sustainability and the design of the project, and it's become a landmark and a benchmark for other developments to continue. The second project I'll be showing is the Microsoft complex. Microsoft has set up a very big development site in Israel. It's in Herzliya, and this is not far from the beachfront, and we wanted this development to have views to the beach and the ability for people to walk outside of the building as well as inside. So going out from every floor and reaching, not just using the elevators, but using terraces and steps going from inside to outside and back again. Again, we've freed up a lot of the space within after the first floor plan, the first floor, in order to allow for planting and those terraces that climb up to the rooftop. And in this building, you can see how people can come out from each floor and walk using stairs and going up to floors, going to meetings, having meetings being conducted on the floors and on terraces outside of the building. So being outside, but also inside of the building and having views to the beach. And here again, we freed up all the rooftop for planting and for spaces to people to spend time outside, outdoors. This is very important for the well-being of people inside the offices. And the sustainability ideas are not just technical issues, there are issues of psychology and well-being and having people relate to the building that has an outdoor space and not just a box of offices. So this is the south-facing facade, and you can see here that we've actually used the second floor of the building for a big planting, a big garden that is various flora from the area that we've actually brought back and developed on the rooftop of the building. We're also allowing for people to walk outside of the building in various floors. So we use this element that is now fully grown vegetation to shade those transparent, those glass elevators that we have here, the red ones. And then this is now fully grown, and people have sit here for meetings and enjoy the outdoors. We have we can extend the mid seasons. Obviously, winter is a bit tough and summer is very hot, but we have very long mid seasons that we, by allowing a good design and sustainable design, we can lengthen the time of those mid seasons for people to spend outside. So here a view of the rooftop and the terraces, and the interior of the building that also has ideas of planting inside, and the use of recycled materials for its acoustic ceilings. And the building has 2,500 people working in it. During COVID time, obviously it was empty, and now they're starting to come back. But from what we've heard from the tenants is that everything we improve and everything we bring into these buildings that is involving sustainability and the use of outdoors and reuse of outdoor space for vegetation and for well-being and for spending time outside is fully acknowledged by the tenants of these buildings. And definitely, I think this was the shape of buildings to come and the benchmark for these buildings to come in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that presentation. And thank you also, Davina. It's amazing and so many questions. I don't even know where to start. And it's incredible to see the knowledge coming together to make these things possible and to really address those sustainability issues and questions and agendas. So where to start? Well, let me start maybe by also warmly welcoming all the attendees on behalf of the University of Sydney. It's still pretty, I still find it pretty amazing that we can all come together virtually from across the world, people joining us from Israel and from Australia. Someone posted that they're joining us from Malaysia. And so if you are feeling comfortable, please maybe let us know in the chat where you're joining us from, because I think it's just fascinating to see where everyone is coming from and joining in. I'm joining from my home office, which is here in Sydney, and that's located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Maybe I'll jump straight into some of the questions from the audience, Davina and Jonathan. There's some really good questions, and actually one of the questions connects to something that you said, Jonathan. You talked about how you were dealing with sunlight during, I think in both projects you talked about that, and obviously you need to get sunlight right and the shading right. And so someone said in the Q&A chat, something I wasn't aware of myself actually, that in New South Wales, in Australia here, apparently there's a regulation that units and apartments need to have at least 3 hours of sun every day. And that's not the case in Victoria. So I guess a question for you, Jonathan, is what was driving your decision when you were thinking about how to design the buildings in terms of sunlight and shading? And then I'll come back to you, Davina, with a follow-up question as well.
We have a very tough southern direction from the sun. And for this, it's quite easy to treat this with with just a small shading element, because the sun is obviously quite high in the south. And the most problems we have is with east and west elevations. And obviously the positioning of the building is the most important thing, because when you position a building with its narrow facades towards those tough east and west elevations, you solve the issue. Obviously, this is a case that is confronted sometimes with views, maximizing views and rents and so on. So I think positioning in the building in the right direction is definitely the first issue to deal with when designing a project and treating the sunlight.
Great, thank you. And Davina, I mean, you showed this really beautiful diagram about how the Green Star rating works and how it also considers health and well-being. So how is sunlight, for example, considered in that?
Look, daylight's really fundamental. It's something we measure in the rating tools, but I acknowledge that this question is also about how do we get the regulatory settings right, so as well as the premium buildings, we can move this across all of Australia. And so I note that we are spending time in deep engagement with governments around the country about what they're doing on sort of Gira's first question, which is about sunlight and how we make sure we get the right daylight. But also we're spending a lot of time working on biodiversity and green requirements, because there's been a huge focus in the pandemic around people's health and well-being, biodiversity, the lungs of the earth. You know, there's an enormous focus on green spaces for all of these reasons. And so that's why part of our role as a not-for-profit is spend a lot of time with government. Right now, we're working with New South Wales on the SEP, where we're seeking to mandate greater green infrastructure or extra trees and plants for these really important reasons.
And so maybe we'll stay with the rating system for a moment. There is another question in the chat, which is around, well, it discusses the problem of the local urban heat island effect and how buildings contribute to that effect. And the question is whether that is also considered in the rating systems in any way. And if yes, how, and if not, but it could be or should be.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, this kind of urban heat island effect is focused in all of our rating systems, whether it's the ones that impact the biggest buildings, it asks for consideration to be taken. But even in our humble single dwellings home rating system, it either requires there to be a green roof or a light coloured roof, because urban heat island, or, you know, for those who aren't engineers or follow the sustainability movement, the urban heat island is where everything gets really hot, because you've got a lot of air conditioning close, you've got a lot of black roads, we don't have enough planting. So that's an enormous focus for us, both within our rating tools, which we call advocacy and action, and also in our critical work with government, because you're absolutely right. We've had a landmark development, we actually have had the planning minister in New South Wales, one of the states in Australia, announce that they're going to ban black roofs in a development, and we're working with them for what it would take to scale that at, you know, sort of at a jurisdictional level. But another one of our roles is to work with the Australian Building Codes Board for how do you take these ideas and how do you implement resilience or designing for the future into the code at scale, because, you know, there's predictions that locations are going to be absolutely unlivable in the heat unless we radically adapt our designs for these requirements.
Great, thank you. I will, maybe I'll stick to the audience questions for a moment, because there's so many coming in as people have lots of questions. And also thank you to everyone who has shared where they're joining us from. So we've got Melbourne, we've got Perth in Australia, some from Africa, from Uganda joining us, and also people have already earlier said that we have some attendees who have a background in agriculture and in industrial design and architecture. So it's a really very diverse audience there. Just maybe for a quick question that a few people asked, a few people were interested in the slides of these presentations. So just to let everyone know that this is being recorded, and the talks will be made available via the Technion YouTube channel. And we will also see whether we are able to share the slides as well with all the attendees. Now, there was an interesting question on the Q&A chat about how this all translates to smaller buildings like domestic houses, and because obviously a lot of and it's maybe connected a little bit to another question that came through in the chat about how these buildings that Jonathan showed us are quite spectacular building that are quite expensive to build, obviously. So how, I guess it's a question from the audience maybe that we could unpack in terms of like how can this be considered on a smaller scale, and should it be, and is it considered? Davina, maybe I'll start with you, please.
Yeah, I'll start with that. So the Green Building Council of Australia has just launched our homes rating scheme. And it's designed to go after volume home builders, people who build most houses in Australia, to take these concepts, because we don't want to see them in the bright, shiny towers and then not have them available in our own homes. And so if you look at the principles that we're talking about, you know, like net zero, highly efficient buildings powered by renewables, I have that at my house by buying green power, and I'm currently doing an efficiency retrofit right now. If we look at, you know, the health focus, you know, as it relates to the broader sustainable development goals, that is absolutely something you can have with low toxin materials, low toxin carpets, looking at air quality, ventilation, you know, absolutely designed in. And, you know, some of these concepts of resilience or designing on the future at a home scale, that looks like, you know, reflective roofs. In my case, I have you know, the new section of roof is all white. It's surf mist. Instead of, you know, the black roofs that have become just so fashionable, putting in local planting, drought resistant landscaping, rainwater tanks, all these concepts scale all the way up and down the spectrum. And I would, you know, what we don't need is a small number of people doing, you know, really shiny towers. What we need is to take all the projects and we need to change all of them to hit these goals. So if anyone's saying, how does that relate to my house? It absolutely does. You know, so the things that you can do is get more efficient fixtures and fittings, absolutely look at how all these things can be implemented and changed in your home and take them across the built form, because it's actually residential, which is over 57% of the emissions within buildings in Australia. So there's a heavy focus on homes and apartments because, you know, the spaces where people live takes up a lot of the energy in this space. So it's absolutely the focus.
It comes back to Ori's soccer team analogy, doesn't it? It doesn't matter how big countries or smaller countries, we all have to contribute, and the same for the buildings. All of the buildings have to contribute to this goal collectively. Jonathan, when it comes to actually implementing sustainable design strategies, and lots of people in the chat are commenting on this as well and saying, like, we need more of those ideas, and obviously people are feel very passionate about this change that we're starting to see. But Jonathan, in your projects, from your perspective, as someone who's actually building these things and implementing these strategies, what do you find as some of the biggest challenges that you have to overcome in order to really design buildings in sustainable ways?
I think obviously the challenges are having awareness from the developers and from the clients that require those standards to be in the buildings, because if these clients are motivated and the developers have an idea that the green buildings issues are key factors in people deciding whether to rent or to buy apartments in those buildings, then they will promote these issues into development, and obviously people who rent or live in a house that it has that scores high on sustainability and is designed in a way that it's truly sustainable, they would never want to go back to a building that isn't. And once well, at least in Israel, where still sustainability is not as dominant in the public opinion as it is in Australia, but also in Israel, we see a big change in the requirements from people to have key sustainability issues implemented in their developments.
There's so many questions coming through, and I'm afraid we might run out of time to actually answer all of those questions. But maybe we'll stick with you, Jonathan, for a moment. There are a few questions around materials. So we don't have to answer them all. We won't have time to answer them all. Someone asked about the double glazing. I think someone else asked about the costs of materials, whether to what extent they're recycled. And there was also just a question coming in, how you choose, maybe we can answer it that way, as collectively, how do you choose the suitable materials in those high-rise building projects? Because obviously there's so much complexity and so many things you have to consider when you're making those choices. So how do you do that in practice?
Well, I agree with the numbers Davina showed earlier, that it's just a few percent more costly than it would be if not addressed as sustainable. and definitely saves a lot of money for those people inside. Obviously, a better insulated building or development, or it saves a lot of energy, and energy costs are soaring now. So this is the most important. A lot of it is the economical model of those people who rent these buildings, where, as in the past, they would pay their electricity bills, so the developer wasn't really concerned if the building is well insulated or is saving energy. And now renters are asking to know exactly what sort of energy ratings that those buildings have. In terms of use of materials, I think that stone, for instance, because the carbon footprint of stone is almost being erased from from use, at least in Israel. We know that excavating natural stone has a high carbon effect and is not really doesn't really go along with sustainability. So there are many artificial stones that we use as being made in Israel or around or in Turkey that we can bring. But bringing stone from China, for instance, which was very dominant in the last 25 years, has almost stopped in the last few years.
Interesting, fascinating. Thank you. We will end with one final question. I'll start with you, Davina, and that's for anyone in the audience, anyone attending this who wants to get involved or learn more about this. Where do they start? What's your suggestion? What's your tip?
Well, I think look what you can do with your own, your own home, your own project, your own property. Absolutely reach out to us at the Green Building Council. We'd love to work with you. I'd really like to give the audience question the credit. There's, one of the speakers in the audience was referencing and saying that Australia has a really strong role in climate change, and they're absolutely true. We're in the top 3 emitters per capita for the carbon we export, so we absolutely have a role in this space. So I'd really encourage everyone to play their role, and thank everyone for the great questions. Fabulous to be part of this event.
Thank you, Davina. And Jonathan, what's your tip?
Well, I think we have to look at recycling developments. We have too many old and not sustainable developments that, instead of building new developments on agricultural land, we should just stick to our developments and recycle those developments again and again. Buildings don't have to be eternal. They can be recycled every few years.
Yeah, so true, so true. Thank you very much, both. Virtual applause from everyone, and apologies to all the attendees if you weren't able to answer your question today. I hope you still are taking something away from this discussion and from these really fascinating presentations. So I'm going to hand us now back to Ori to wrap up the session.
Thank you, Martin. I'm sure we could have gone for another hour easily, but we try to stick to our time. So on just a quick clarification, it's not my soccer team, it is Ronaldo's. It's just we can all play, we can all be part of it, we all should be part of it. I wanted to, on behalf of all our guests today, thank our speakers, Davina Rooney, Jonathan Groswasser, and Martin Tomczyk for moderating today. And I also wanted to acknowledge our event partners, the Sydney University, the Green Building Council of Australia, and the Israeli Embassy in Canberra. And if, like Martin mentioned, we will share this presentation with you in the next few days, so you can review it again and share it with your colleagues. And we hope to see you again soon. The last comment is there's going to be a very quick survey at the end of this. If you can take 30 seconds to respond, that really helps us improve. Thank you very much. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.